NTFS partition is a good idea for a larger network or a network where security is an issue. NTFS provides a lot more security than the FAT system does. The FAT system also does not support compression under Windows NT. Neither drive space nor double space are supported by Windows NT or NT Workstation. The preferred file system is NTFS, which stands for NT File System. And it's the preferred system for Windows NT for several reasons. The environment must support it. In the case of a dual boot, like I talked about earlier with Windows 95, Windows 95 does not support an NTFS file system, so it's not an option, at least on that partition of the operating system, to use NTFS if you're going to do dual boot with Windows 95. Only Windows NT supports the NTFS file system. But some major benefits for the NTFS file system are that it does support long file names, it does preserve case, and the recoverability features of it. It uses transaction logging to automatically log files and directory updates. It has a lot of built-in security features for local security as well as network security. And it supports compression. Also, that the size of an NTFS partition, it can support up to 16 exabytes. That's a lot of information that it can support on one particular size for an NTFS drive. There are some limitations, however. One of the main limitations is that it's not compatible with other operating systems, and it uses a lot of overhead. For dual boot or small partitions, less than 200 megabytes, it's always better, or it's usually better, to use the FAT file system. If we look on the graphic in the screen, we can see that there's a good comparison of comparing FAT and NTFS when deciding on which to use on your operating system. As you can see, the features and limitations that I talked about earlier are here in a really easy to understand graphic. Both the FAT and the NTFS partition support long file names. However, FAT does not support compression and does not have the extra security features that NTFS has. However, if you want to dual boot your machine, FAT is usually the better option. The file partition size is also an important consideration, considering that FAT only supports up to 4 gigabytes, whereas NTFS supports up to 16 exabytes. And the recommended partition size for a FAT system is under 200 megabytes, whereas NTFS can support up to 16 exabytes. Next, let's discuss a little bit about implementing security with the NTFS file permission. As I talked about earlier, one of the advantages of NTFS is that it has the ability to implement security. And there's two different types of security. There's local security and domain security. Now, with the Windows NT Workstation, sometimes it can be confusing on whether to implement local versus domain. And when your users log onto the machine, which one to use and how to implement that. So hopefully this will help clarify things for you. Local security is just simply the ability to restrict access to a file or directory to someone who is sitting at the keyboard of the particular machine that you're implementing the security on. Even if somebody can log on, they can be restricted. That's one of the main advantages of Windows NT Workstation over Windows 95 or Windows 98, because it has a lot of the more strict security that Windows NT Server carries so that you can implement these things on your users. NTFS is the only file system used with Windows NT 4.0 that has the ability to provide local security. The FAT file system can only restrict files with share level permission and not local permission. However, if you're going to choose a dual boot scenario, you must use the FAT file system for universal access across operating systems. So you can use the Windows 95 and Windows 98 and Windows NT or Windows NT on the same computer. However, the NTFS partition will not be recognized by Windows 95 or Windows 98. Windows 95 or Windows 98 must be on the active partition, and it must be FAT. All applications must be dual installed under Windows 95, Windows 90, or Windows 98, and Windows NT. So there's one way to get around that, however. If you install your Windows 95 first and create a partition, a fat partition on your drive, and it has to be the primary one, and then you have another physical disk and create that as an NTFS partition, you can create, you can have Windows NT and Windows 95 on the same machine. However, it's a little bit different than dual booting. To have a pure dual boot, you've got to do it on the file system.
So we've been through at length the planning stage, which has gone through describing the different formats, different ways that you can install, your installation options, your hard disk options, file formatting, security, how if you're going to set up a network, if you're going to share local resources on a computer, or if you're going to access them on the network and things like that. I think most common in the real world, you are asked, should I install Windows 95 or Windows 98 or Windows NT Workstation as a network or client user operating system?
That's right, and it's important as a consultant or as your network administrator to know the difference between each operating system so that you can make the best decision for the network that you're making recommendations for.
Windows 98 is probably the most flexible and easier to use types of operating systems. However, Windows NT Workstation gives you such a higher level of security, but then along with that comes the administration factor. It's very easy for users to misinstall or mess up an operating system on Windows NT Workstation than it is for that to happen on Windows 98.
Yeah, I think one of the most common questions that we get when we support a Windows NT Workstation client is that a client may log on to the local machine versus the domain, and when you do that, that changes your security and even what applications you can view. So the user gets confused and they don't know where their machine went or why they can't connect to the server, and if they're logged on locally, that can really confuse a user. So that's the most common.
Right. And well, Windows NT Workstation forces you to log on every time just to get into the system. So you either have to log on locally or log on with a domain user account. And if you simply forget your password, you can lock yourself completely out of the system and not be able to get into the system at all. With Windows 98, that wouldn't happen. Right. Okay, we've been through quite a bit of theory and a lot of talking, and now we're ready to go ahead and do some computer demonstrations and actually walk you through an installation of Windows NT Workstation on our computers here. With installing Windows NT Workstation, or server for that matter, you always want to check the hardware compatibility list. This is very important. Windows NT Workstation is a very picky operating system, and Microsoft will not support the installation if you've tried to install it or you're trying to install it with hardware, systems, components, any type of equipment that is not officially on their hardware compatibility list. Also, you want to make sure that your hardware meets the minimum requirements. The minimum hardware requirements for a Windows NT Workstation installation on an Intel-based system is that you need a 33 megahertz processor or higher. For example, an Intel Pentium, a Pentium Pro, or a Pentium 2 microprocessor. Also, you will need at least 12 megabytes of RAM, and that is a minimum specification. For hard disk space, you'll need at least 110 megabytes of hard disk space, a VGA monitor, a high-density 3.5-inch floppy drive, and a CD-ROM drive, unless you're planning on doing a network installation. If you're going to do a network installation, you will need a network adapter card, and you will also need a mouse and a pointing device. The hardware requirements for a RISC or Alpha-based system are the Digital Alpha AAXP-based processor, at least 16 megabytes of RAM. You will need at least 148 megabytes of hard disk space. You will also need a VGA monitor, and you will also need a 3.5-inch floppy and a CD-ROM, and also a network adapter card and mouse. Beginning the installation, you have some choices on how you want to install your workstation. You can install using 3 floppy disks and the CD-ROM, and that's what we're going to do here. You can install it locally using just the CD-ROM and using a special switch that I'll show you to create your own 3 setup floppy disk. You can install over network, also creating those 3 floppy disks, or you can do it over the network without any floppies at all. So now let's go and take a look at our computer and start the installation. I have just booted this computer with the setup disk 1, and what the computer is doing right now is it's loading files for the Windows NT Executive set. Okay, now it's asking for disk 2. Okay, this is the point in the setup where Windows NT asks you if you want to continue by pressing Enter. If you need to learn a little bit more about the setup, you can press F1. You can repair, this is actually how you would repair a damaged installation of Windows NT Workstation, that you would restart the installation, and at this point you would press R and insert your emergency repair disk. You can also bail out of the installation process at this point by hitting F3. We're going to go forward, hit F or Enter to continue. This is where setup automatically detects your floppy disk controllers and your hard disk and other SCSI devices as well. You can let Windows NT installation do this automatically and try to detect everything that you have in your computer, or you can skip this at this point and actually add devices or drivers that you might have directly from the manufacturer after the fact. I'm going to go ahead and let Windows NT do its thing and detect them itself. Click in, so I will hit Enter. The installation wants setup disk 3, which is our last floppy disk. The setup has recognized the following mass storage devices. This is a CD-ROM with an IDE controller and my computer. It asked me if this is correct. Go ahead and hit Enter to continue the installation, which I'm going to do so. And Windows NT will install the device drivers necessary to access that CD-ROM drive. Microsoft includes their licensing agreement in every installation of their product. In order to get through to the bottom of this installation, or the licensing agreement here, you have to press page down until you get to the very end. Of course, you should read your license agreement. If you agree to it, you hit F8 and the installation will continue on. This screen is asking me to confirm what setup has determined that my computer contains as far as hardware and software components. The PC is standard, the display is auto detect, the keyboard is all standard, the mouse is a Logitech mouse port, which is a standard. So there's not really anything that I want to change here, but if I wanted to, you can go and scroll up and change these options at this point. Go ahead and select Enter to continue. Now this is the point in the setup where it is asking me, do I want to install Windows NT on the highlighted partition? Now on this machine, I already had a copy of Windows NT Server and NTFS file system already existing on the machine. I am actually going to start over, and I'm making this machine, installing it as a workstation. If this were a Windows 95 or a Windows 98 machine, you would probably see the C colon here, and it would say FAT for the file system. I'm going to delete this partition, hit continue, and you hit L to confirm. So now I have deleted that partition. I'm going to create a partition. I'll create it the same file size of my maximum file size for my hard disk at 2 gigabytes. Hit Enter to create, And I'm going to format this partition using the FAT file system. Now, depending on how large your hard disk is, and depending on how fast your computer is and how much memory that you have in your computer, this could take a while. Okay, now that Setup has completely formatted my hard disk in the FAT file system, it's asking me to confirm where I want Windows NT to install. What directory do I want it to install to? And by default, it's the WinNT directory. So I'm going to choose to accept the default and click Enter to continue. Now, do I want Setup to perform an exhaustive secondary examination of my hard disk, or do I want to just skip that and go ahead and go forward? Well, I'm going to go ahead and go forward because I feel quite confident that my hard disk has no problems. However, if you're in doubt, it's a good idea to go ahead and do this, but it could take a long time to perform that check. If you hit Escape, it will skip that operation. Now Windows NT will go through a series of copying the files from the floppy and the CD-ROM onto your hard disk to complete the installation and the GUI part of the installation once the computer reboots. Okay, now Windows NT has successfully copied those installation files to my hard disk, and now it wants me to remove the floppies, remove the CD-ROM, and reboot the computer. The installation then will continue from the files that it just copied from the hard drive. Okay, now that the computer is rebooted, it will go into more of a graphical portion of the installation, and kind of a wizard setup as well. Click Next. Right now we're in the gathering information about our computer stage. We have 4 different types of installation that we can choose at this point. Typical is what most people do. It's your typical installation with what the average user needs on their system. If you're installing Windows NT Workstation on a portable computer, a laptop computer, then you want to choose this option, which would take and put less files on the hard disk and different drivers and things like that. Also, if you have a computer that's very limited on the hard disk space, you have the minimum, but you really want to maximize your hard disk space, you'd want to choose the compact, which puts the least amount of files necessary to run the operating system on it. The custom is for advanced users, and that allows you to pick and choose what type of systems and drivers and applications that you want to install with your installation. We're going to go ahead and go through a typical installation. So I'm going to click Next. At this point, you have to put in your name. And you will need your CD key. And this is the part of the installation that asks you what your computer name is. This is the NetBIOS name of your computer. It can be up to 15 characters in length. And it's also how the other computers on your network will interface with you. It's the friendly name for your computer. I will name this computer after myself. I must choose an administrator's password at this point of the installation. It's very important to remember the password for the administrator, however, because when you get to a point, Windows NT Workstation, and it reboots, it's going to force you to log on, And you'll want to log on as the administrator so that you can configure the system. If you forget the password, you'll be unable to do so. I will leave the password blank. At this point, it's asking me if I want to create emergency repair disk. This is a disk that copies important parts and pieces of your configuration and your system registry to a floppy disk so that you can reinstall Windows NT at any time that you have a damaged installation. You can create it right now, or you can decline and create it at a further date. We won't create it right now, but we'll go back and create it after we can finish our installation. Do I want to install the Windows NT optional components, or do I want to install the most common components? You can click here to show me the list of components so I can choose, and it will show you all of the types of systems and little applications that you can include. If you click it checked, then that means it will include and it will install now the standard games. You can click to install the Windows messaging, which is email systems that are included. The next phase is where it goes on to installing Windows NT networking portion. You can opt to not do the network installation, driver and component installation at this point, or you can skip it, or you can go ahead and do it now. We'll go ahead and install the networking component at this point. This computer is hardwired to a network. We do have a network card in the computer. We have cables and networking hubs. So we have a small little Ethernet network here. So I will choose this wired network. You also can do this option, which is a dial-up networking type of called remote access. We'll cover later. This is the point where Windows NT wants you to either start a search for a data card so Windows NT can try to recognize what type of card you have in your computer, or you can select from this. You can also select drive from a disk of manufacturer your network card. I'll go ahead and start the search. Windows NT can find what type